Hello and welcome to the video version of the Happier Work podcast. I'm your host, Aoife O'Brien. The video will start after this quick 1-minute intro. And I have a brilliant guest for you today, Molly Johnson-Jones from Flexa Careers. Molly and I talk about all things flexibility. We talk about some of the blockers to flexibility. We talk about asynchronous work and whether or not we've taken that it's a little bit step too far. We talk about the difficulty in managing in that hybrid and remote type of environment. But we also talk about the benefits and the potential to drive personal and professional growth when we are working in a more flexible way. One thing I'll ask you to consider as you're listening to today's podcast is what could you do differently to learn about your own working style and what works best for you. So whether that is a different type of flexibility that you're looking to try out or just to try something different to experiment a little bit. And I would love to invite you to get involved in the conversation. All of my social media links are on happieratwork.ie. Enjoy today's episode. Molly, you're so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Do you want to give people a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me, first of all. So I'm Molly. I am the CEO and co-founder of Flexa. And Flexa is the platform where flexible companies get discovered. So we enable people to search by how they want to work, as well as what they want to do. So making the job hunting process much more transparent by enabling people to filter out companies based on exactly what their working environment preferences are. Didn't always do this. We launched about 2 weeks before the pandemic started. Literally, couldn't have timed it at a more weird time. Thankfully, it all worked out well in the end. We've now got over 1.5 million people using Flexa, but at that point we had zeroed. We literally just launched the platform. And the reason for us starting it very much came from personal experience of not having that kind of information when I was doing my job hunt. And I just started my career in investment banking, very much not flexible, in the office 5 days a week, 16 hours a day, absolutely no flexibility on hours, location, anything, and which was actually really not well suited to me at all because I have an autoimmune disease. It means that sometimes I can't walk. So being able to get into an office 5 days a week was actually quite difficult for me. And after about 18 months, they said that I could request the option to work from home 1 day a week. And 10 days later, they put a settlement package in front of me, sacked me, and told me to leave immediately. So I then learned the hard way that they definitely weren't open to flexible working. And I was plunged into that job hunting process, needing 1 day a week from home, but not being able to find that information. And that's a problem that's now experienced by hundreds of millions of people all over the world because flexibility has been realised as such an enormous non-negotiable for so many people.
Definitely. There's so much I want to explore with you. I think the first question I have is in relation to the investment bank. Obviously, you're not going to name names, but presumably having gone through the pandemic, they're a little bit more open to flexibility, or that entire industry is a little bit more open to flexibility. What are you seeing yourself?
There's definitely a bit more openness. I don't think that kind of thing probably wouldn't happen now, or at least I hope it wouldn't. But in traditional industries, there is still a lot less flexibility, and I'm sure you've seen the studies where there's a recent one from KPMG that said that 64% of CEOs hope that we will be in the office 5 days a week by 2026, which is quite scary that that's the ideal that they are striving to reintroduce. I hope the reality is different, but a lot of those CEOs are from traditional industries like finance, insurance, etc. So I think the rate of change in industries like finance and investment banking has been frustratingly slow. And one of those reasons is, I think, both cause and effect. They're a very undiverse workforce, so therefore less likely to push and need flexibility, but also they're never going to be able to change that because without offering flexibility, you cannot have an inclusive working environment, which therefore won't foster diversity.
Yeah. So it's chicken and egg situation, essentially.
Yeah.
Coming back to the CEO, so you mentioned it kind of tend to be traditional. What do you think is driving that sense that they want to have people in the office 5 days a week?
I think it's quite a complex mixture of factors. I think One is generational. So these are the people who made their careers by being in an office face to
Mm,
face, getting to know people over a pint at lunchtime and
mm,
taking people out on the golf course. But and those are generations also that don't really value flexibility quite as much as Gen Z and millennials do. And obviously sandwich generation as well, to a slightly lesser extent than Gen Z and millennials, but still much more than, for lack of a better term, the boomer generation. Um, so I think there's partly knowing familiarity and being like, well, I did it, so why wouldn't the next generation do that? And I
mm,
think actually, as we see millennials and Gen Y come into leading in those kind of C-suite roles, there will be a higher rate of change. I think also the other bits that are kind of driving the desire to return to the office is fear of the unknown. I think it's very difficult for people to kind of adapt and change when something is totally new to them. And I think that they worry that their management styles, or I actually know they probably don't worry, but their management styles are not adapted to distributed teams. It's a
mm,
very different way of managing. It's very intentional. It's not as simple as, oh, you're here at your desk on time. That means you're committed, and you're leaving it a bit later than everybody else. That means you're the hardest worker. That's a very easy way of managing someone. And I think they're lacking the ability to potentially intentionally manage. Not everyone, of course, this is sweeping generalizations. And I think the final one is a lack of trust. I think that they have genuinely believed the rhetoric that when people are at home, they're sitting watching Netflix in their pajamas and not doing anything.
mm,
So I think it's a high level of suspicion and a lack of trust that is also driving that desire for performance to be measured by presenteeism again,
mm.
rather than output, which ultimately is the best measure. Is
Yeah,
are you getting stuff done or not? It doesn't matter where
yeah,
you are.
exactly. Yeah, even if you are sitting at home watching Netflix in your pajamas, if you're still getting the work done, then that's okay.
Yeah.
But it has been shown that actually it tends to be the opposite to that. So we have this perception that if people are at home, they're not actually getting much work done. But it's been shown that they're oftentimes it's the opposite. So they're getting more work done to the point of actually reaching burnout. Any thoughts
Yeah.
around that?
Yeah. Again, I think it's there's so many factors, it's the kind of thing we could talk about all day of um remote and burnout and lack of boundaries. And I think a lot of the difficulty with adjusting to working from home and putting up those boundaries is I think people didn't know how to manage themselves in those environments. Like it was very much a new experience working from home. And if you're always in front of your laptop, and sometimes that's watching Netflix in the evening, but then you've got Slack notifications on, and that it's you have to create your own boundaries. And again, be comes back to that word intentional. Like you have to be very intentional with the way that you work. I think people are getting a bit better at that now and kind of understanding themselves and how they work best. Like personally, I thrive when there's a lack of boundaries. I like everything molding into one, and therefore being able to go and get my nails done at lunchtime or go to the gym and then come back to work like that. I thrive in that environment, but
Mm,
there are people who prefer rigidity and need to create their own boundaries. So I think that's kind of a whole big topic of how we get the best out of ourselves at home.
mm,
But the productivity discussion, I think, is quite frustrating because there's absolutely no evidence that being in the office 5 days a week is more productive. The biggest study that was done by Nick Bloom, who's a professor at Stanford,
mm,
and he's looking at productivity, happiness, and engagement. And it's a study that I create the most because it's the most widespread in terms of industries and one of the biggest sample sizes. And it's also relevant. It's across roles as well, rather than just looking at one role type.
mm,
So it's pretty reliable when we look at how the workforce is behaving. And he found that the productivity with hybrid and in office was pretty much the same, and then remote it was slightly lower. But remote obviously has those massive cost savings, and also it's cheaper to attract talent,
mm,
and also people are generally happier. So there's those benefits. So particular for startups and scale ups, remote first often makes sense. And then he looked at hybrid and in office, and hybrid also could mean remote first, like going in twice a month or once a month, just some form of regular in-person contact. And he found that that was equally as productive as going to the office every day, but people were happier. more engaged, better diversity, and it was easier to attract and retain talent as well. So there is no upside to going into the office every single day. And it's quite frustrating that there is still this rhetoric that that is the way, what we should get back to. People need to get back to work. It's like, well, we've
Mm.
been working this whole time, just
Yeah,
in
yeah,
different
yeah.
places. And so I hope that more studies and more obviously very credible people start to openly speak about this, because we do need to find a balance, and we do need to find a replacement
Mm.
for what was a 5 day inflexible way of working, because we've learned so much. Like, why would we go back to that way of working that did not enable everybody to thrive? It enabled a very select group of people to.
Mm. Yeah. And that comes back to this idea of diversity that you were talking about. Molly, I'd love to come back to this idea of talking about outputs and outcomes from work, because it's something I never tire of talking about this stuff, and
Yeah.
how to shift that mindset from, well, I worked from 9 till 5 today, therefore I was productive, but rather like thinking about your priorities, how you're impacting on the organization, and what we need to focus on. Because I think it's taking a huge mindset shift for people to think in those terms, rather than, oh well, if I took 2 hours off here, then I'll make up those other 2 hours, as opposed to, well, I've got everything done that I need to do today, so it's okay if I knock off early.
Yeah. It's a very it's a huge mindset shift, isn't it? Right. I think the idea of flexibility, and when I think of flexibility, it's a two-way street, but I also see it in my head as being like, if work is a big block of time, right? On some days that block might be 6 hours, on other days that block might be 12 if you got a really, really busy day. And depending on how you like to work, you might chop that up. Like, I'm online from usually about like 8 in the morning until about 11 at night, and I chop that block of work up depending on what else I'm doing. And if I don't have any more, then obviously I won't go back and try and find more work. And I think the first thing is that flexibility is a two-way street. So for flexible working to work, when you do have a quiet day, yes, it should be that you don't sit staring at your laptop wondering if anything else is going to happen. You should go and, as you said, kind of clock off. But then on another day where your company does need you to work longer because there's deadlines and more stuff to get done, you are there as well, because you're conscious that 3 days ago you were able to stop working at 4. And I think sometimes that is forgotten, and it's one of the definitely the benefits of flexible working, that being in an office 9 till 5 does not allow for, because you are there. And it's
Mm.
bad for the company as well, because then when you need people past 5 or 6, or whenever culturally it's acceptable to leave, you're less likely to have them. So there's that kind of first bit. And then I think there's also like, time is just a terrible marker of performance.
Yeah.
Like, some of my longest days have been some of my least productive days, because I've kept trying to go at it, right? And you keep trying to bring back to being productive. And I think again, it comes back to intentionality and intentional management. Like, are employees being targeted with, whether it's KPIs or OKRs or specific weekly tasks that need to get done? Like, are they clear on what they're meant to be achieving, rather than just grinding away for hours? And some of the best companies that I know that do it is very KPI based, and very much like, these are your responsibilities to move the needle on. You have freedom over how you do that, but we expect you to get to here this quarter or here this year. And given more trust and autonomy, because flexibility can't work without trust and autonomy either.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up the topic of autonomy. It's something I spoke about on a recent episode of the podcast, and I suppose it formed a huge part of the research that I did myself for my master's a few years ago. The importance of not, and I suppose for me, the important thing with autonomy is the balance. So it's not giving people too much autonomy, so that they're kind of left a bit
Yeah,
directionless, but it's also not about controlling everything that they do, so they feel a total lack of autonomy. So as you were mentioning there, it's having those really clear expectations, be they
yeah,
through KPIs, OKRs, but then giving people kind of flexibility around how they're going to achieve that. So you give them
yeah,
really clear direction and guidelines, and then leave them to their own devices. And if they need support, know that you're there to support them.
yeah. And I think
Um,
that works for the majority. I think sometimes you do have people that do need to be spoon fed, and they prefer that. And I think
yeah.
also it's about not, like, my automatic way of managing somebody is not necessarily the best way to manage them either. So I'll always ask someone, like, how do you want to be managed? Like, what will
Exactly.
help you to thrive? Like, do you
Mm.
need me to tell you at the beginning of the week all the things that need to get done, or do you want me to give you a big goal and you work towards that, working those things out?
Mm.
And it varies between the individual. And something I've really noticed that I find fascinating from managing quite a few people over time is that women are often much more aware of how they want to be managed. And
Okay, interesting.
when you ask men, they're like, "That's a weird question." Like, we've spent more time having to think um, in companies of how we come across and how we want to progress, and it's like there's been much more thought gone into
Mm.
how we work.
Yeah, we have much more awareness around what we're doing and whether or not we're saying the right thing or kind of almost catching ourselves or masking
Yeah.
because we know that we need to be seen as performing at work. Interesting.
And have to be more strategic in the way that we are seen at work if we're going to
Mm.
be given the same progression opportunities and same ownership, I think, as well,
Mm.
sadly.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to come back. You mentioned earlier about yourself and how you like to work, and I suppose I did see a post on LinkedIn about that, and I was like, "Wow, isn't it so refreshing to hear someone say that?" So it's not about completely reduced hours and compressed time and all of this kind of stuff. It's about finding for ourselves how we like to work. And when you said that, I was like, wow. So I think you talked about 7 days a week and it's okay. And we all have different ways of switching off. And do you want to talk to me about that?
Yeah.
Because for me, it's sort of maybe it doesn't apply necessarily in a corporate setting, but certainly as a business owner, I found it very refreshing to see that it's actually okay. It's like permission slip to work in that way because it works for you.
Yeah. And, I think lots of companies are trying to adapt to the different needs of their workforces. And as you said, like, there is this burnout issue. But then also, if somebody wants to work 7 days a week and they're working slightly reduced hours 7 days a week, like, I wouldn't personally stop them. Like, that's the way
Mm.
of working that works for them. And we have people who do that here.
Yeah.
I think it's again about kind of looking at that output, but also checking in with people. Like, if someone's working really late one evening, I won't really notice or say anything. But if that keeps happening,
Mm.
then you check in with them and you say, is it that you're taking a bit of time in the day and then you're just preferring working in the evening, or can I help and take something off your plate? So I think for it to work, it's also about having that very supportive management and awareness as well. But yeah, for me, flexibility is about choice and about freedom. And I think we haven't had to think about that in our careers until COVID forced us into this mass flexibility experiment. I think it's like going to school, isn't it? You just turn up 5 days a week, and you know that you've got to be there at 9, and you'll probably leave around 6 or 7.
Mm.
Um, and that was just the way it was done. So we never really learnt how we were most productive
Mm.
within any other environment apart from that. And so now I think when it's, I work and travel, I've worked in Canada and Greece and Slovenia and, all over the world. And I've been able to combine that with running a company and understanding that, I'm not a particularly morning person, so I probably won't start until half 9, 10. And then I like to be able to go and exercise at lunchtime, and then I'll probably head home at kind of half 6, 7, do some exercise, and then pick work up again in the evening if I've got stuff on. But I know that works for me, and I always
Mm.
encourage different people to experiment with what works for them. Like, we have core hours of 11 till 3 at Flexer, and people are totally free outside of that to do whatever works for them. We just expect people to be online for those
Mm.
4 hours. So there's collaboration time. Yeah, we have this enormous opportunity in front of us for people to create ways of working that truly do enable them to reach their potential, both professionally and personally. And it's something that we've never really had before. Because, yeah, as I said, it was like going to school. You just turned up, you did your work, and you left again.
Mm.
And that was the expectation there. So I think we've ventured into a lot of unknown for a lot of people, and I think there are teething problems like mental health consequences and burnout, and for some people not doing enough work, and then 64% of CEOs believing that no one's doing anything. We've
Mm.
got these issues to overcome, but I think they will come out in the wash over the next kind of 3 to 5 years.
Really, I think it's interesting. I love this idea of facilitating people reaching their potential, and what you said about work being like school. You just sort of show up, you know, you have to be there for certain core hours. If I think back to my own corporate days, and if I had a client meeting, I knew I had to be there. So that might have been an afternoon, it might have been an hour or two in the middle of the day, or I might have been there for the whole day. But I knew, and again, it was like you show up and you just know that you have to be in a certain place to do a certain thing. But the thought behind, beyond the hours that you're putting in, of like, what's the impact that I want to have through the work that I do?
Yeah.
What's going to move the dial for me in my career personally? What's going to move the dial for the business that I'm working for the team that I'm working with, in order to reach their objectives as well? So there's so many things I think that we didn't really consider from a work perspective. And like you say, this has given us a huge opportunity to consider all of those kinds of things in a way we've never really thought about them before.
Yeah, totally. And I think we've also been able to explore the different kinds of work. So for me, there's a difference between sitting at my laptop, being there, working through like, the hard stuff that you need a screen for. Then there's your kind of ad hoc work, replying to emails, replying to messages, voice notes, that actually that's a level of work that I think I've probably found most powerful running a business, because although you yourself are not necessarily producing anything, you're unblocking people, you're answering questions,
Mm,
you're making sure that you're not standing in anyone's way. And I think the more fixed hours approach doesn't enable you to do that. So that's why I'm online so much, is because at any one time that somebody will need me, I can just voice note a response to a question or make a decision. And for me, that doesn't feel like work. It just kind of feels like you're checking in and you're carrying on. But it's enabled us to move so much more quickly. And I think it's that layer of work that's kind of work, but kind of doesn't feel like it.
mm,
That flexibility has really unlocked. And I think that's really exciting to be able to see what level of productivity and progress we can make when there's your work, where you're sitting at a laptop and focusing, but then also this other level of um, technology facilitated communication
mm.
amongst distributed teams.
Yeah. I mean, there's the other work that you do away from the laptop as well, like with a notepad and pen, or the thinking time that everyone needs as well. I think we forget about that sometimes.
Yeah.
But I love this idea that you're talking about, like the different kinds of work. And it brought me back to a question that was posed on the podcast probably about a year ago now, but it's like the philosophical question: what is work? Like, what actually is work? So how do you define it? Is work only when you're in front of the laptop? Is,
Yeah.
and you're kind of saying, actually, a really important part of the work that you do is that ad hoc stuff that's unblocking the way for other people to be able to get their jobs done. So you're not standing in the way, or you're realizing what the issues are, or you're solving problems there in the moment.
Yeah.
So I love that kind of approach. It brings me on to this idea of asynchronous. So I hear a lot of people talking about asynchronous work and the
Yeah.
importance of that for flexibility. Do you want to kind of talk about that in the context of saying, okay, well, I need to be there to unblock these problems and solve the problems kind of in real time almost?
Yeah. I think some companies have made totally asynchronous working work, where people will be working all in different time zones, and it's all done by Loom meetings and Loom videos and recorded meetings and Slack messages and things. Um, I personally couldn't see that working for our company, and there are lots of companies that feel like that is almost like a level too far.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of no rules approach. And I think actually you can't really have true freedom without boundaries. Like, people need to
Mm,
know where they stand and what the expectations are of them, which I'm sure asynchronous companies do ultimately have. But I'm sure there's a natural gathering together of people at certain hours, which is why we have the core hours approach of like, this is our get shit done time.
mm,
And then otherwise, it's kind of like voice noting back and forth and working around things. But there'll never be more than, say, 2 hours where somebody's out of something, and not kind of moving things along. So I think the asynchronous tactics work very well in tandem with either in-person contemporaneous collaboration or remote contemporaneous collaboration. I personally would struggle to never be working with somebody at the same time and just bouncing back and forth and making progress. Like for me, that wouldn't work. And I know it's the same for a lot of companies. But again, it's that kind of type, it's the ways, different ways of working. We don't have to have one, we can have many
Mm.
in many types of working and ways of working in one day. And that actually probably is the most effective of all of them, of that
Yeah.
in-person time, that remote time, that asynchronous time, that contemporaneous collaboration time. There's
And
lots of different types.
it probably comes back again to personal preferences and figuring out what works really well for you. Because when I'm thinking about it, again, thinking back to my corporate days when we were working with teams all over the world, and in order to move projects forward, it's really hard to do that if you send a request and something comes back, and then you have to almost wait a day before you can get something else back because of the different time zones. And it
Yeah.
makes it really hard to progress on projects like that. So I can understand in some ways, and maybe there's kind of better rules to have around it, of like, this is the order of events, or this is the order of the sequence of things, so that you get things back in a time that suits you better rather than a time that suits the kind of the messenger better, if you like. But I love this idea that you said about freedom with boundaries. So giving people that freedom, but again, setting those clear expectations and giving them boundaries around what is what they're going to do. So that might be, as you mentioned, the 11 to 3 o'clock. Any other thoughts to add on that before we move on?
Being clear, yeah, imagine if you were going to someone's house and they were like, you turn up between 12 and 7, and you'd be like, what? Like, what time do you actually want me?
Yeah.
And so like naturally people like a bit of guidance.
Mm,
Like you don't like being told exactly what to do. But yeah, being clear that it's like it's okay. Like we try to give those boundaries like a flex, like it's okay to start any time between, 6 in the morning and 11 in the morning, like whatever
yeah.
works for you, but we expect you online for 4 hours after that, and then it's fine for you to chop and change. But you have to be clear on what you expect from people and also what the consequences are if somebody is availing of like the utmost flexibility but they're not performing. And I think
Mm,
so there's two different things within that. There's your expectations on your working environment and boundaries of your working environment, and then also expectations from a performance perspective and what the consequences of that will be, because naturally as humans, when things start to go wrong, we're going to want to try and pull a bit of control back,
yeah.
so those boundaries do become stricter. And maybe coming back to the 64% of CEOs conversation, like maybe that's what they're feeling right now. Like we are in a macroeconomic downturn. They are potentially therefore trying to take back control and take back control of their performance in their business, and they are erroneously blaming that on not being able to see people. There's loads
Mhm.
of different ways that I think people tend to panic a little bit in those situations. But
Yeah. I think maybe even building on your earlier point about equipping people with the tools to be able to do that, or equipping people with the proper guidance themselves. So training for managers and how to manage people in that remote or hybrid environment, as opposed to solely in the office, when they have tended to manage by, oh, you're here at this time and you must be a great worker. So the very different skills that are required in order to manage people in that remote or hybrid environment.
yeah, it's hugely different. I think I would actually say, as a manager, as in anyone managing, it is harder
Mm,
to manage somebody in a remote first hybrid distributed environment because it is more intentional,
yeah.
but it's more effective. I personally, I think, like I have seen and had stronger relationships managing a distributed team and seeing other people do that than
Mm,
in the office, because in the office it's probably incorrectly seen as easy because it's all based on presenteeism.
yeah.
So it is harder. And what I hope comes out of it is, I think that the like management track and career progression is like really over glorified. Not
Yes. Agreed.
everybody
Again,
is
another thing I
good.
talk about all the time.
Like not everybody is good at managing people,
Mm.
nor
Or
do they
wants
want
to.
to. No,
Mm.
but
Mm.
yet it's seen as like that is what you do as you progress in your career. And what I hope is that people with flexibility and it being much more intentional management and ultimately more skilled,
Mm.
I hope that we also start to see more recognition and more acceptance of the kind of IC individual contributor pathway,
Yeah.
because you know if you didn't like managing people in person, it's even worse when you're doing it remotely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's just as valid a career pathway as managing people is,
Yeah.
really.
And I'm sure not just the CEOs get this sense that they need to kind of clamp down on people if they're not performing. I'm sure it's managers as well are feeling like I need to give that person less control, which probably drives then poor performance again. So that
Yeah.
understanding piece of like what's actually driving that behavior. But yeah, it's something I talk about all the time. Is how do we create careers where you don't have to become a manager, where it's not, as you said, glorified that this is the only way to progress in my career, it's the only way to earn more money, et cetera, but actually providing the opportunity for people to contribute to the organization, but not have responsibility for managing people. Um, Molly, you use this term intentional quite a bit throughout the podcast. I'd love
Mm.
to get your thoughts on what that means. What does that mean to you?
Good question. Intentional, yeah, in the sense of management or um, understanding yourself. I think when I talk about intentional, it's thinking more about either yourself or other people. So I think for in work, it's often the people, the very human side of it, the emotional side of it is often ignored.
Mm,
And I think what flexibility has kind of forced us to do is realize that home life, work life, emotions, professionalism, they're all intertwined.
mm,
And that's why I talk about flexibility requiring more intentional management, because I think you have to bother to get to know the person you're managing, or you have to bother to get to know yourself to understand how you're going to thrive, because you're not just put in a box and told to perform. Like, you're given a lot more freedom, and with freedom, you have to start to understand yourself. So,
mm.
intentionality, I think, is making a conscious decision to try to understand the situation and how that can best be handled, rather than just reverting to familiar tactics.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I love that explanation. I love that description. Um, Something that that occurred to me at the start of our conversation was I'd love to understand more about the kinds of companies that you see embracing flexibility already. So we kind of touched on this idea that those maybe big, more traditional industries, big traditional companies are less likely to do it. They're more likely to stick with their traditional tactics. But I'd love to understand more about the kinds of companies that you're seeing embracing flexibility at work.
Thankfully, we are seeing hundreds of companies doing it.
Mm.
And it's not always um, startups and scale ups as you might expect. Like,
Yeah.
I think naturally it's harder to create change in corporates because you've got tens of thousands of people to undergo like an organizational transformation project with, which is a lot harder than 100 people. But we are seeing tiny startups that have had it in their DNA from the very beginning, all the way through to scale ups that were around from before the pandemic, but they've further embraced it because they've seen how much it can help, up to corporates like, we work with Mars, Virgin Media, Centrica, all of whom were very traditional businesses before, well, some slightly before the pandemic, but back to 2010, incredibly traditional businesses that have seen the potential that flexibility has, both in terms of talent attraction, also in terms of engagement and productivity. But fundamentally, diversity is key for those large corporates, because they literally can't hire enough diverse talent at that scale. So they've had to really embrace flexibility. And it's wonderful to see so many companies work with us and want to be super transparent over what they're offering, because that's how we create change, is by flying that flag and pioneering all of these different flexibility approaches. Um, so I always talk about it not like a vertical of an industry or a company size, but a horizontal of flexible working environment. But it's a spectrum, isn't it? There's 2 days
Mm.
a week from home and a little bit of flexibility in start and finish time, all the way through to asynchronous, fully remote work anywhere in the world, and everything in between as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I was going to ask about that as well. I love your description that it's a horizontal rather than a vertical. So you can't necessarily, they obviously have one thing in common, that is that they want to support their workers, they want to drive diversity, and they want to create happier working environments through flexibility as well. They have this belief in flexibility.
Yeah.
Um, You mentioned transparency as well, and that, I suppose, one of the key drivers for you setting up Flexa to begin with is this idea of flexibility, because you couldn't find it anywhere else. Now, coming back to, I suppose, the likes of LinkedIn, and what I'm seeing there is that they're advertising things as fully remote when actually they're not. So I love the idea that you are offering this total transparency about, well, what is actually on offer here. But can you talk to us about the different types of things that people are offering? Because I know there's some kind of unusual things that you talk about.
Yeah. So I think transparency for me is so important because just the word flexible working is ultimately meaningless. Like nobody knows what that involves. And 80% of the global office population say that flexibility of some kind is a non-negotiable. But how do you match those two things up
Mm,
when an individual that wants 2 days a week in the office versus 1 day a month in the office versus never to go into the office? There are three different people looking for three different roles, even if they have the same skill sets and
mm,
are looking for the same job title. And yet companies are still going with the generic, yeah, whatever, we're open to flexible working. So that's incredibly inefficient.
mm,
It's like you're going to be playing musical chairs until 2050. Like we need to be able to let people match themselves up with companies that suit their working preferences, and companies, if they're transparent, will attract aligned talent that thrive in the environment that they have. And as you said about the LinkedIn remote issue, like companies have a tendency to want to catfish people into applying because
mm,
there's this myth that I think is really, really prevalent within the industry that like getting as many applications as possible or as appealing to as many people as possible is what you want.
no.
Whereas you don't. You want people to opt out of applying because you're not right for
Mm,
them. Because
exactly.
then you get people that opt in because you're perfect
Mm,
company and perfect environment for them. And that information should be provided up front. There's no point wasting both parties' time and going through 3 hours of interviews to only find out that it's a bad match.
mm,
You know, I think recruitment can learn a lot from dating in that respect. Like people
yes.
disclose a lot of information before they go on a date because what's the point of going on a date otherwise? There's
Mm,
going to be non-negotiables for both parties. So that's what we're trying to facilitate because we spoke to so many companies. And in my previous career, I saw it a lot with companies that offered flexibility and asked them why they didn't publicize it. And they were like, well, where can we? People have already, where they do put it, like their careers page or job description,
mm,
the company, the individual has already heard about that company and gotten to the point of being interested. Whereas actually, that how many companies have you never heard of? Probably 99.9% of them
yeah.
have you don't have an employer brand like Google or Patagonia or Innocent or Coca-Cola. Um, but by leveraging a flexible working environment, you can be matched to great talent without them having to know who you are and
Yes.
without having to get in this get your employer brand lost in meaningless black and white job adverts that everyone hates reading.
Yes.
Um, so what yeah, we're just trying to make it genuinely transparent and easy to find the information that lets people make an educated decision about whether or not your company is the right place to work.
Mm,
Um, because I think there was this really shocking stat when LinkedIn first launched those filters of hybrid, remote, and in person. And 68% of companies text remote, and only 18% of them actually were.
yeah.
But what are we
Yeah.
meant to do with that information? And I had a text from somebody the other day, a friend of mine, who was like, I applied to a role on LinkedIn and it was down as remote. And she's like, and then I went and searched on Flexa and found out that actually they want me in 2 to 3 days a week in, I think, Leeds, and she lives in London.
Mm,
And she's like, well, I obviously can't do that. And she's like, I'll never trust LinkedIn again. And she's like, but
yeah.
why are they saying that on LinkedIn when they're also telling the truth on Flexa? She's like, what's the
Yeah.
end game there?
Mm. Yeah, it goes back to your point, I think, that they want as many. They think that it's a better idea to get as many through the door rather than
Mm.
thinking like we need to filter the funnel at the top so that we only get people who are a really good fit, a really good match for the organization.
Yeah, and that's the benefit of treating hiring like marketing. I always
Mm,
use the analogy of a hiring, like the funnel,
totally. Yeah.
and marketing funnels generally have three. You have top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel. Hiring funnels tend to only have middle of funnel and bottom of funnel, really, because you're just trying to encourage people to cold apply. They have
Mm,
never heard of you before, have no awareness of you at all, and you're just trying to get somebody to apply without having any knowledge of what your business is or what your ways of working are, and then push them down. But if you told a marketer to approach marketing like that, they would look at you like you'd lost your mind.
Yeah.
They were like, it's incredibly inefficient and incredibly expensive. And recruitment is expensive because you're relying then on reactive hiring of job platforms every time you're trying to hire a role, agency recruiters who are expensive. And a lot of those roles, like obviously there is a need for recruiters as well, but not for every role that people go out to recruiters with. And by creating that top of funnel and that employer brand and getting tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people to know your culture, your mission, your working environment, your benefits, you are creating a hiring machine
Mm.
because you're proactively hiring, not just reactively hiring.
Yeah, brilliant. Love that. Molly, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, what does being happier at work mean to you?
To me personally,
Well, I like to think of it as philosophically, what do you think being happier at work means?
it's a very good question. Um, I personally think being happier at work comes back to that idea of thriving in your own way.
Mm.
So I think we've touched on lots of these different areas. Like not everybody wants to be a manager. Not everybody wants to rapidly progress through their career and keep earning lots and lots of money. Some people want really great work-life balance and to be told they're doing a good job at work, but also be able to go and switch off at home. Everyone is it's very individual. And I think being happier at work has to be facilitated by giving people freedom to work out exactly what works for them and gives them an environment in which to thrive. And thriving will be totally different from person to person.
Mm. And if people want to connect with you, if they want to find out more about Flexa, what's the best way they can do that?
Probably follow and connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a lot about pretty much everything we discussed. So yeah, please do follow and kind of connect with me there. Or if you're interested in finding more out about Flexa, please do visit our website. We've got lots of kind of interesting free tools like benchmarking your environment against the market and lots of different ways that you can understand how to leverage your flexibility to your kind of best possible advantage.
Brilliant. Love that. And I can second, I absolutely love Molly's posts on LinkedIn. Straight down the line, there's brilliant, really insightful and just full of
Sometimes
vibes, I think.
controversial.
Controversial at times, but that's good, I think, just to raise people's awareness of these things that are happening. So appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. I loved this chat on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.